Well, thank you, everybody. I'm really excited that you're here. I'm happy to be here. It's very cold and very snowy. You could be at home right now ordering pizza, and I'm thankful that you chose to instead be here with me. And hopefully we have a little fun and talk about space law. I think space law is very fun. I'm also a Star Trek fan, so merging the two was kind of an exciting and fun prospect for me. So my goal here tonight is that we have some fun, right? I was inspired to get engaged with this process and do a SciPop talk because my book club, who thank you for being here, we all went to one last year on the physics of the Flash, and I managed to learn some physics. Now, I do like math and science, but I'm a lawyer. I don't use physics on the regular. So teaching me some physics was a pretty remarkable ability, and it was because it was fun, right? And so my hope tonight is that we have a little fun, joke about Star Trek, enjoy a science fiction show that I presume if you're here, you probably like, and maybe learn a little bit about international law in the meantime. So please, like she said, hold questions till the end, but I love questions. Please ask them. If we don't get around to everybody tonight, feel free to contact me via email. I love to talk about this stuff and geek out about space. So who am I? I'm the executive director of the Space, Cyber, and Telecommunications Law program here at the University of Nebraska. You might be thinking to yourself, why the hell is there a space program in Nebraska? I will make you wait till the very end of this presentation to answer that question, but I promise I'll get there. What that means is I do most of our research development, so I spend a good chunk of my time doing nothing but research, and scholarly and legal research is not one that gets a lot of attention because we don't need big lasers. It's mostly pencils, paper, and people. But we do quite a bit of research engaged with the University Affiliated Research Center with Strategic Command and those sorts of projects, as well as mentoring students, working with students, and the general administrative tasks that come along with directing a program. I'm a space geek from lifelong, right? This is not new to me. I will say my legal career started a little bit more on the tech side of things. I was a web developer. My work in law school was really about electronic discovery and how we use electronic evidence in the courtroom, kind of positioned or pivoted that into space law. They're very interconnected, believe it or not. So it made a lot of sense to me to move there, but I am a legit attorney licensed in the state of Nebraska. I think it's relevant for this conversation to say that my first Star Trek, and this is how you can age everybody in the room, right, was The Next Generation. That's what I grew up watching with my family. As I've gotten older, I have watched some of the original episodes, or most of the original episodes, and of course Deep Space Nine, some of the spin-ups, and of course Voyager. I waffled so many times on this meme. I do like being called captain of the Space, Cyber, and Telecom program, so I encourage you at any point when you ask a question to refer to me as captain. But secondarily, the other meme I almost picked was a joke about how the first female captain in any of the Star Treks ended up with a spaceship that was also the same name as a minivan. But I kind of didn't like that joke because I also happen to really love my minivan that I drive, which is not, sadly, a Voyager, but it's a Toyota Sienna, but it's a great car. I encourage you to get a minivan. They're awesome wagons for anything you need. Also, I just felt like I had to share this to share my street cred as a Star Trek fan. I'm also part of an all-women's running team who is called Run Long and Perspire. We're part of the Market to Market. We run from Omaha to Lincoln, and at every one of our stops, we do our pew-pew laser phasers as we tag into our next runner. So I am legit as a fan in that way, although I did discover in this process I am not a mega fan, as so many people are, because boy, did I find some great fan sites to do a lot of this research. It was really fun to dive down that rabbit hole and to take a look at this. So when I usually talk about space law and being a space lawyer, I have this slide, and it's normally a guy in a suit who's wearing the Darth Vader helmet, right? Obviously, I couldn't do that here, but it's a joke about what do you think a space lawyer is? That sounds so made up. And I realize that. It sounds super made up. But I found a Star Trek space lawyer, which was harder than you might think. Lots of politicians, lots of people who are philosophers talking about ethics. Not a lot of lawyers in the Star Trek universe, like lawyers proper, right? So I want to introduce you to Colonel Worf, right? This is from the original series. He defended Captain Kirk. He was also played by Michael Dorn, which, if you're a Next Generation fan, you know also played Lieutenant Worf on the Next Generation episode. And according to the fan universe, Colonel Worf is Lieutenant Worf's grandfather. So there's one of your fun facts about a lawyer in space law and a lawyer in Star Trek. I found one. But jokes aside, in the real world, what the heck is a space lawyer, right? Most space lawyers, and when I say space lawyer, I mean attorneys that are working in the aerospace industry, and that could mean government, that could mean military, that could mean private sector aerospace companies, but they're really not practicing space law day to day, right? Most of these lawyers are doing transactional law, procurement, export control and compliance, the standard things that keep a business running. A good example of this, a friend of mine, she's general counsel at Blue Origin. Last time I saw her, the dealing that she had all day that she was messing with was a drunk driver had hit a fence next to one of their warehouses, and she was like going through a liability issue with the insurance company to pay for the repairs, right? That could be any company. That doesn't have to be a cool company like Blue Origin. That's Jeff Bezos' aerospace company. It happens to be a super cool aerospace company, but that's the kind of legal work you'd be doing as in-house counsel virtually anywhere, right? They're supportive of the mission. Space law might impact some of the things that they do, but first and foremost, they're just good lawyers, and generally they're business or transactionally focused lawyers. Very few space lawyers are really kind of in that litigation subset, although some, and that's growing and changing as we're seeing more lawsuits in the space industry. Now, there are people who do use space law all the time, right? You have your policy directors, you have your legislative liaisons. I could come up with distinctions between those two, and technically they are, but we can wrap them in the same bow as lobbyist, right? So these are the people who are on the Hill representing their company, their client, whoever they might be, whatever sector they're in, talking about space law. And then, of course, academics who write in space law. I definitely talk about space law every day with our students. And, of course, when I make silly lectures about television shows, also do a lot of space law work. So use it quite a bit. All right, so what is space law? Now I've told you that space lawyers don't do it, so what is it, right? Space Law 101, it's a thing, like a real thing. I like to think that most of my colleagues in other areas of the law don't have to spend quite as much time validating that the area of law that they research in is an actual thing. But we do, and that's all right. It does not exist in the hypothetical. There's $1 billion satellite industry out there. So yes, occasionally in space lawyers, and certainly what you see usually in media, are these kind of fantastical questions of, what if there was a colony on Mars and someone murdered someone else? And we can talk in the hypothetical, and certainly it's fun to play there. Lawyers love that. But there's also a real life business and industry that relies on this body of law, and it's much older than most people think, right? So it's absolutely a built-out fundamental area of the law. My personal way of describing this, and this is something that nerdy lawyer scholars debate, I view space law as a subset of international law, right? It's primarily international law, and that international law then dictates a lot of the national space legislation we see in spacefaring countries. So I view it as this type of international law, and then we can think about it as it pibbies into different national space legislations and different space regimes in many different countries. So there are multiple treaties and several significant domestic legislation or regulations, here in the United States. And tonight I'm going to pull some key concepts from some of those and compare them to the Star Trek universe. Now, for the most part, I can't do this letter to letter because our universes don't function in quite the same way, but I have found some good themes. And I'm really bummed that I don't have like 10 hours with all of you because I love this stuff. I would love to get into the nuances of the Outer Space Treaty and a lot of these different agreements and conventions, and we simply can't do that. That is probably not what you came here tonight for anyway. But certainly send me an email. I'll send you the whole treaty. But tonight we're going to focus kind of on the Star Trek universe, but I want us to look at that word compare. Comparative law study is also a thing, right? And this sounds very academic, right? This is a legal scholar who's really focused entirely on the study of the differences and similarities in the legal systems of different countries. That sounds maybe interesting, but pretty academic in nature. It's becoming more and more practical. This is absolutely important. In the last 20, 50 years, we have become such a globalized planet that almost any practice area is impacted by the legal structure of another country. And that's not just comparing the definition of murder to the definition of murder, right? That's also the system as it builds up, how the court systems translate, what's authoritative, what's not, how their laws are made, what the impetus for those laws are. So this is a really important area of study. And so as I was thinking about this presentation, I thought, how can I bastardize this important area of law and boil it down to something about Star Trek? So here's what I came up with. Right, here's what we're going to do tonight as we think about comparative law as it relates to real space law and Star Trek. We're going to do who regulates space, who makes the laws, who's creating the laws. We're going to do why. I think this is something we don't think about enough when we think about the law. Why? What's the ethical reason? What's the intellectual imperative? What's the impetus for those laws? And then how? How do you write it? How do you craft it? How do you enforce it? How does it work? Right? So that's how we're going to break down thinking about and comparing about these two bodies of law. So who? Let's first start with who are we talking about when it comes to make laws. I tried to throw in some funny jokes. This one doesn't really fit very well, but I just thought it was really funny. So this is our who. We're going to start with the United Federation of Planets and then the United Nations. So the Federation of Planets is this interstellar alliance composed of governments, and they purport to basically operate semi-autonomously, but it is a single centralized government. The United Nations, 193 member states, takes on many issues confronting humanity in the 21st century. Most of you are probably generally familiar with at least who the United Nations is, right? But they are pretty distinct. The United Federation of Planets is a centralized government. It's a unified executive branch. There is a president, right? A representative republic is generally what we would model that off. And I thought this was interesting. I didn't realize that there is a constitution. They don't talk about it in a whole lot of episodes, but certainly most of the different things that we know about the Star Trek universe pull from this constitution, and it's really particularly focused on enumerating rights for sentient beings. Now, over at the United Nations, we have this General Assembly. So we do have this idea of one nation, one vote, similar to a representative republic, but as far as a centralized government body, that's simply not there, right? This is a diplomacy mechanism. Still very important, but not quite the same enforcement mechanism. We have this idea of sovereign equality. We in the United Nations value deeply sovereign equality between all the different member states. And just to be really clear on this, when I'm talking international law, I'm going to use the word state. I'm not talking about Alabama versus Georgia, those sorts of things. It means country, right, in this context. I'm sure many of you knew that, but I didn't when I started law school, and it led to lots of confusion. So I'll clarify it now. But there's no central government, and we have this idea of this sovereign equality, right? All these different member states have an equal vote and an equal say, and we take their sovereignty seriously. They each have their own government. We do have a sort of judiciary, and I say sort of. We have the International Court of Justice that's part of the United Nations. Now, when two countries take a claim or an issue in front of the ICJ, in order for that to be binding, both countries have to agree to that. Sometimes that works very well, sometimes it doesn't. That decision, whether they've agreed for it to be binding or not, can be persuasive. Now you might be saying persuasive to who if it's not binding? Well, other countries, if they're picking sides, might think, well, the ICJ thought about this really hard, and this is what the ICJ thinks the outcome of this should be, right? Sometimes they think it's going to be binding, and then they decide it's not. We did have a space case in front of the ICJ in the 80s. There was a Russian satellite that came down, had nuclear propulsion, spread across the Canadian tundra. Canada spent millions of dollars to clean this up. It's in front of the ICJ. Russia, of course, does not think this should be binding because they think they spent money they didn't need to spend, so on and so forth. It ended up going into closed-door arbitration, eventually was settled. But ICJ, what they said might have been persuasive, but it wasn't actually a binding authoritative outcome. So you might be saying to yourself, well, then what does international law mean, right? If there's no judiciary, how do we enforce international laws? Well, diplomacy, right? We have sanction mechanisms, and then at the end of the day, we have military action, right? That's how we enforce international law and agreements with our allies and our adversaries. One thing that they do have in common, I thought this was a really fun fact, both of the charters were signed in San Francisco, California, which I'm going to guess is a nice little nod to the UN from Star Trek. So within the United Nations, we do have the Office of Outer Space Affairs. A lot of people don't realize that there is a space office at the UN, right? And they're really cool, and they're super nice people. They work to promote international cooperation in the peaceful use and exploration of space and the utilization of space science and technology. The other piece that they do that I think is particularly interesting is if a member state does not currently have a space regulatory system, they are a resource and an aid in crafting one, which is to say, here's how you can build the laws that apply in your nation that are compliant with international law and the international treaties, right? So there's this resource here for states that want to get into the spacefaring business. All right, so that's our who. Now let's talk about our why. Why does the United Nations have UNOSA? Why do we have these treaties? Why do we do the things that we do? And the why I think is really important. Here's a very, very tiny little story for you. Imagine me at a dinner party. I have my glass of wine in one hand. I have my cheese tray in the other. I have the traditional quandary of how do I eat the cheese? I'm holding the wine. And then I have this person talking to me. And they, first of all, don't believe space law is a thing. So we have to get past that. So I have 30 seconds. If it's a thing, here's the laws, blah, blah, blah. And then why do you lawyers have to regulate everything? We get this a lot, right? You love laws, you love rules. What's your issue? It should be the Wild West. Everybody wants everything to be the Wild West. Cyber law, space law, should be the Wild West. Why are there rules about this? And I'll say it, it's a fair critique, right? There's a thought to that it should be open, wide, we shouldn't have all these laws, we shouldn't have all these restrictions, we shouldn't have all these rules. I can accept that and I can understand that as an ideal and as a philosophy. But there are reasons that we have laws and regulations. The first one, and I really like this quote, this is a real quote from John Young, he's one of the first astronauts on the shuttle program. Anyone who sits on top of the largest hydrogen-oxygen fueled system in the world, knowing they're going to light the bottom, and doesn't get a little worried, does not fully understand the situation. This is dangerous as hell, right? These are flying bombs. Whether they blow up on the launch pad, whether there's a crewed mission on board, whether or not it crashes or it breaks apart over the ocean, over environment, over a crowded urban area, this is dangerous. And we have a sordid history, but a history in our country, like many other countries, of regulating highly hazardous and dangerous activities, right? Look at the aviation industry, look at trains, look at mining, look at explosion, all these other things. We regulate for the safety of our citizens. That's important, right? We want to protect everybody. The other reason that we regulate in space is because we said we would in the Outer Space Treaty. I'll get to that here in a little bit, but basically we have international obligations that say, fine, we'll pay attention to what Americans are doing in space. All right, so how about Star Trek? Why do they have rules about the law in Star Trek? I love this quote. This is sort of like a prequel episode that I hadn't seen until I was doing research for this, and then I had to find it on YouTube and watched it. Someday, my people are going to come up with some sort of doctrine, something that tells us what we can and can't do out here, something we shouldn't do. But until someone tells me they've drafted that, wait for it, ready? Directive, I'm going to have to remind myself every day we didn't come out here to play God, right? If you're a Star Trek fan, obviously you know what the hint is there. Someone's going to draft some sort of directive, right? But here the idea is that we're concerned about this playing God, right? That we do not rule space as a species, as a group, as a government, however you want to phrase that, right? But that space should be this open place for all. All right, so that was our who. We have the United Federation of Planets. We have the United Nations. We have our why, right? These are explosions. This is war. We're all very scared of war, right? I didn't really hit on space debris, but this is in there too, right? Wanting to keep space clean, keeping it pristine, being worried about debris. We kind of see that general theme come up in both of those. So how? How do we regulate space? Well, here on Earth, Earthside, when I first practiced this, I kept saying real world, and I just couldn't stop thinking of the theme song from the show on MTV in the 90s. So now I've been saying Earthside, which sounds very stupid as well, I agree, but it somehow feels better in my head. So Earthside, on the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, there's 107 countries who are parties to this treaty. This includes all the spacefaring countries. For anything like me, I thought there's 107 spacefaring countries. Right on my hands, I can maybe tick off like 10. This includes everyone who's partnered together, right? So all of the companies that are part of the European Space Agency. This also includes small satellite launches, anything like that, telecommunications practices. So there's actually quite a few countries in the space game. Now, an interesting part of the history of this treaty is that it's absolutely born of Cold War origins, right? Think about 1967. We're in the middle of the space race. People have gone into space, they've orbited, but it's still 2 years before we're going to land on the moon. Lots of tension, lots of fear about war in space, particularly lots of fear about nuclear war in space. And our tensions with the Russians particularly are problematic and scary for a lot of people. That is what this treaty is born of, and it's all over the face of it. It's very thoughtful about peaceful purposes and about restricting certain types of activities in space. And I think that's really interesting. Most legal scholars, I think, would agree, and I tend to agree, that if something like this, even with modernized language, was to go up in front of the UN now, it would never happen. We would never get the signatures. The restrictions this places on activities in outer space is significant to a point that I don't think most modern countries would be willing to stop their activities or refrain from activities in this way again. So I think it's a really interesting political time in which this treaty is born. And it's not without its criticisms, but for the large part, it has worked, right? We haven't had a major war in space, and it has helped not have certain weapons in space. So it's kind of an interesting treaty to look at. It's also a pretty short one and a pretty easy read. So if you're intimidated by reading a piece of international law, if you go to the UN website, look this up. It's not very long. It's pretty easy to read. It's a good entry-level treaty to get an idea of what that looks like. So in the Star Trek universe, we have the Prime Directive. This is also known as the Starfleet General Order 1 or the Non-Interference Directive. Basically, it's the embodiment of this ethical philosophy about non-interference with other cultures and civilizations. Here's the language. No starship may interfere with the normal development of any alien life or society. The lawyer in me immediately wants to define interference and alien, right? Anytime I got a verb and a noun, I need a definition. Right? And we get there a little bit. We'll jump into it. I at least got something for interference, but started to work on this. Here's your actual language of what that means, right? So this really big motivation on preserving cultural autonomy. So what I've done I can't compare line for line the Prime Directive to the Outer Space Treaty because they simply don't line up that way because they're coming from different universes with different problems to address. So what I found were themes, right? Themes of what we're worried about to what they're worried about in the Star Trek universe. So I'm going to start with peaceful purposes. So on this side, we have things that are actual articles from the Outer Space Treaty, paraphrased language though. Exploration shall benefit all. Moon and other celestial bodies may only be used for peaceful purposes. Space and celestial bodies are free for all to explore. So again, you see that peaceful purpose language and that idealism of how we're using space. Caveat on some of this, that exploration shall benefit all. That doesn't mean financially or directly, right? We're under no obligation after a mission to come back to Earth and share that with all of our adversaries or anything like that. But the idea here is that our exploration should be to the benefit of our species and to the benefit of humankind, potentially to the planet, those sorts of ideals. We also can't stop other people from exploring space. Right? We can't say that this nation, as a sanction, is no longer allowed to act in space, right? We can't do that. Space is open for all states to explore. On the other side, we have the Prime Directive. It's not just a set of rules, it's a philosophy. Of course, I had to go to Captain Picard, right? History has proven again and again that whenever mankind interferes with a less developed civilization, no matter the intentions, the results are invariably disastrous. So again, we have this idea of, you may not go rule space, it's not yours for keeps, it's for everybody. Right? Don't ruin it for anyone else. So this peaceful purposes sort of idealism and theme that we see in both documents. I really liked this Gene Roddenberry quote: "The strength of a civilization is not measured by its ability to fight wars, but rather by its ability to prevent them." And we definitely see that in the Outer Space Treaty, right? We're very interested in peaceful purposes, and we absolutely see that in the Prime Directive philosophy, right? So keep it pristine. States shall avoid harmful contamination of space. This is an actual provision in the Outer Space Treaty, one that we kind of play a little fast and loose with. Not just us. Many states, you've probably heard about space debris being an issue. Satellite, if you saw the movie Gravity, it's a bit of, it's not quite accurate, but it's getting there, right? It's not too far off, sadly. Right? So this is an interesting issue that we're dealing with and wrestling with as part of the Outer Space Treaty. It's really a diplomatic and a political issue more than it's actually a technological issue for us. And over here, I kind of found some ways that we are actually defining what interference means, right? No identification of self or mission. You cannot interfere with the social development of said planet. No references to space, other worlds, or advanced civilization. So that's what we mean when we say don't interfere. So the theme that I pulled out of this was keep it pristine, don't mess with it, let it do its own thing, right? Don't throw your trash in space, and don't taint these civilizations in this way. So what happens when we don't do what we're supposed to, right? I'm going to look at liability in the Outer Space Treaty, and I want to look at failure to conform in the Prime Directive. I also liked this meme because I feel like Data could get pretty funky before he would actually get in any trouble. So as far as liability in the Outer Space Treaty, states are responsible for any national activity. This includes non-government activities. And activities of non-government entities must be authorized and supervised by the state. If any of my students were in there, I might be pointing at them and saying verbs, right? It means we are obligated to do something, right? Those are our obligations. So what this is about is this idea of liability, and the concern is that if you have if you got Billy Bob Thornton building the rocket in his garage, he manages to do it and it bashes into a Chinese satellite. Billy Bob probably can't pay China the several millions to billions of dollars to make up for that loss. So they're going to come to the United States because we're all parties of the Outer Space Treaty, and we said that we would take care of our citizens, right? And so because we are obligated for the actions of our citizens or our companies or any of the launches that we license, we regulate them. Right? We authorize and supervise those activities. It's a risk-sharing regime in the licensing process where there's an insurance. There is a certain amount of indemnification or a point where the government will actually pay for some losses, right? But we have a responsibility to pay attention to what people are doing. A lot of this language a lot of our domestic legislation in the US refers to launch and re-entry. We're currently all squabbling about what they do in between that. It's a problem that we didn't think of when we wrote the legislation. We're regulating them when they launch. We're regulating them when re-enter. No one's really paying attention when you're up there, right? So we're fixing that. We're trying to fix that. But generally speaking, we are under this authority to have to regulate that behavior. So what about if you break the Prime Directive, right? This is kind of almost more like military law. You think about somebody who would make a decision that was outside of the scope of the mission that they were under, or the breaking orders, or any of those sorts of things, punishment ranging from a formal reprimand all the way to arrest and court-martial. So it's pretty serious, right? This is more of a criminal piece of law. Now, certainly violations of the Outer Space Treaty could in some ways, rise to the level of criminal law, or maybe your country could, do some sort of criminal proceedings depending on what you did. But generally speaking, we're talking two pretty different regimes. So exceptions. There can be no justice so long as laws are absolute. The law students hate this, and they figured it out pretty quickly when they're in their first and second year. Certainly by the time they get to evidence class, they start to realize that law really lives in the exceptions. That's the point of law, right, is to find the exceptions, and that's what a good lawyer does. How do we think about law? And what's fun about that, it sounds cynical, but the reality is that that's where the ethics live. That's where the philosophy lives. That's where we live in a gray zone instead of in absolutes, and that's real life. And that's where we want our law students to be thinking, and that's absolutely true here as well. So again, I thought this was funny, but we're going to talk about rescues, right? So one of the best ways to break the Prime Directive and get away with it is when someone was about to die. I learned by combing through lots and lots of Star Trek episodes where they broke the Prime Directive, which, by the way, is a major plot device in Star Trek, right? It's either the Borg or Prime Directive rules. It's really what you come down to when you survey Star Trek episodes about people when they at any point were in trouble with Starfleet. So you are allowed to break the Prime Directive for a rescue mission, like I just said. The episode that I particularly looked at was Transfigurations. What happens here, the crew comes upon a downed space traveler or space citizen of some kind. He's totally incapacitated, passed out, unresponsive. They take him back onto the Enterprise. Beverly fixes him up. Eventually he wakes up, but they realize his cells are evolving and changing and growing, and no one quite understands it. At the midway intermission third act of the episode or so, he figures out or remembers that he is part of a species from that planet, and there was a subset of their species that was on the precipice of evolving. They were becoming the next level of their species. And of course, the government on their planet didn't like that. They were threatened by it, so they were systematically executing all of the individuals who were evolving. And so he was escaping that persecution, and that's when they found him. Now, inevitably, his government comes and hails the ship and says, you have to give him back. You're breaking the Prime Directive. He's a new species. You can't mess with him, Prime Directive. And of course, I'm certain that there was a much longer monologue than this quote, but we find out that, of course, no, they're never going to give him back. This is within the bounds of an exception of the Prime Directive. They're preserving this new species as this government has slaughtered all but one, right? So we see that rescues are a good reason to break the Prime Directive. That's where our ethics live, in the exceptions, right? Well, I am proud to say that here on Earthside, we have also thought about rescues, right? This is a terrible image of the actual rescue and return agreement. But here we are. The full name of this, I love this, Agreement on the Rescue of Astronauts and the Return of Astronauts and Return of Objects Launched into Outer Space. Just rolls off the tongue. Rescue and Return Agreement. This covers a lot of different things about pieces of satellites and other types of things. But the thing that's important here for this particular event is to think about how the agreement provides for rescues, right? We can take all possible steps, shall, and in the shall world and the law world is very similar to a must, kind of depends on how you think about it, right? Take all possible steps to rescue and assist astronauts in distress and promptly return them to their launching state. I didn't go much into the phrase launching state, but that's a really big one in space law, right? A lot of your liability, a lot of everything you do comes down to where you launched from. And again, preserving or taking an astronaut back to where they went. So we've thought this through to rescue agreements also bypass some of the other political agreements that we have that would prevent us from messing with other countries' space assets, right? I'm not supposed to go take a Russian whatever, right? But if there's a distressed astronaut on it, it might make sense for me, and I might have an obligation, say, to go rescue that downed cosmonaut. So let's take it to the military. I'm sure someone in this room was going to ask me about the Space Force. I'm going to beat you to the punch. I love talking about it. Talk about it a lot. But I want to start with National Security Space Law. It's actually the name of a course we teach at the law school. National Security Space Law. We think about this a lot. We write on this a lot. But let's go back to the beginning. What does the military get out of space? I think this is what a lot of people miss. They think it's just a fun joke, right? I know that there's a Steve Carell show coming out. I'm hoping it'll be therapeutic for me. But here's what the military gets out of space, right? We see global communications, positioning, environmental monitoring, intel surveillance, warning services, lots of the environmental piece, that's also weather, right? All of that. And then asset protection, retaining stability. What I mean when I say this is a good example of this is the GPS validation of electronic commerce. When we all started using credit cards and debit cards instead of cash and checks, we needed a way to validate and timestamp all of those purchases. Well, lo and behold, there was already this wonderful GPS infrastructure that was all synchronized in time, and those validate and timestamp all of our electronic purchases. So if someone were to take out some of those satellites, it's a bit problematic to our entire economy, right, globally. So we have a stability issue of these space assets. Whether they're military space assets or civilian space assets, defense of them is relatively important to infrastructure and stability in our country and globally, right? So we have to think about security. How do we keep these things safe? That's really hard to do. Now, right now, this lives at the Air Force, right? The Air Force has control of everything that we are doing in outer space. And they've gotten a lot of criticism about it. So now we'll go back to June of this year. We were all watching, I'm sure all of you were tuning in, streaming it on your computers, listening to it on your phone, the Space Council meeting that was focused on space traffic management, right? And we're gonna get a new STM policy directive. So bated breath, listening to this. Space traffic management, you can probably assume what that is, right? It's a lot like air traffic management. If your satellites are gonna run into each other, we tell the licensee who owns that satellite to move it so that they don't, right? A lot of people don't realize that all satellites have some measure of propulsion systems, right? So you move them in or out of the way. So this is what this meeting's about. All of the space dorks are really excited, care deeply about STM. And, Space Council talks, Vice President Pence gets up and talks, everyone's really happy with themselves. Then Trump gets up there, and it's supposed to, again, be, and I feel, maybe some people in the room knew, anyone that I know at the policy office did not know it was coming and was completely caught off guard, gets up there and basically says, we're creating a third branch. I am directing the Pentagon to do, or not a third branch, a fifth branch of the US military, and it's going to be called the Space Force. And he used the unfortunate terminology of separate but equal, which I really don't encourage you to use. And this is really shocking to everyone, right? What do you mean a separate branch of the US military? And then it took us about another 6 weeks to actually get a written directive on that, right? And started to think about that. Now we're seeing the Pentagon move on it. That policy office is basically putting an infrastructure in place that would either support the creation of this branch or support the infrastructure of something amended similarly to it. An important thing to note is that the president can't do it unilaterally, right? He is the commander-in-chief of the US military, but to create another branch, Congress will have to amend Title 10, and then they'll have to fund it. Now, that might have been a possibility until the most recent election. I don't think that's going to make it through the House this year. I've been shocked before. Maybe we'll end up with a Space Force in March. Couldn't tell you. But my suspicion is that's not going to make it through the House in the current political situation. One of the ideas that has been getting a lot of traction that I actually think is a good one is for a Space Guard, similar to the Coast Guard. Their entire mission set is defending our coasts and those assets and keeping that particular border or that particular arena and space or warfighting area safe. I think it'd be interesting to see a Space Guard, a group that is entirely focused on space assets and the security of space assets, but perhaps in times of war would fold back under the US Air Force. I think that was something that would be much easier to get through Congress and has a lot more legs to stand on politically and with the general public. The other thing that I think is important, and I was kind of being cavalier about this, but this is not a new idea and certainly wasn't Trump's idea. Maybe the name was, but the idea of there being another branch or another service or a dedicated force or a dedicated corps to space has been kicked around for a very long time, including all throughout the entire Obama administration, right? And we already saw a Space Corps. The House actually approved funding for it. Senate, it died in the Senate. There was lots of friends of the Air Force in the Senate who didn't want something like that to be taken away from the Air Force, seen as a slight. Versions were both opposed and appreciated by former now Secretary of Defense James Mattis. So this continues to be really, really political and sort of diplomatic. But I thought it would be interesting to talk about it in comparison to Starfleet, right? So our Space Force, if it comes to be, still uncertain. Talked about the Space Guard. One interesting question here is how it relates to our international law obligations. You heard me talk about how that treaty is all about peace, right? Maybe this is a problem if we have space operations coming from the military. But the question is here, what is it focusing on? Is it focusing on security, right? Is this entirely defensive? Is this offensive? What is the mission set of the Space Force? I also think there's my personal thoughts on this as I write and work on this. We're already dealing with war in space. It's not people up there with guns shooting, doing any of that, but between jamming of satellites, nudging of satellites, frequency interferences, this is already something that is a significant issue. And space is already a warfighting regime as far as I address it in my research and the way that I write, right? So this is a big issue of how are we defending in space and what does offense look like there? And when does that rise to an aggressive act, which is an important phrase when we're thinking about military operations. Now, if we look over at Starfleet, we have a focus on exploration, right? Very, very different than what we're talking about when we talk Space Force, right? There is a military component to Starfleet, right? They're defensive. I mentioned all the Borg episodes. They're defensive sometimes, right? Like this happens. There's military exercise there. But also, you know, the poor Voyagers lost for what, like 70 years or something? They were exploring. Like that's the goal, right? Is to explore new places and to meet new cultures and to think about space in a different way. Very, very different. Also representative of multiple states compared to representative of one country on one planet. All right. That was kind of depressing, right? I think it's, I work in it, I write in it, I do it all the time. I find it a little depressing. It's hard to think about. One of the things that I love about science fiction and that made me excited to take something like this on is that this is a safe place for us to think about some of this stuff, right? I think a lot of us can think about different episodes of different pieces of science fiction out there that made us feel better about something or made us think about something in a different way or challenge some of our opinions, but it wasn't something that was quite as defensive as our actual real world politics and our actual real world issues because it wasn't our actual politics and our actual real world issues, right? It's a safe place to think about hard shit, right? That's what I love about Star Trek. That's what I love about a lot of the science fiction I like. And one of the things that I talk to my students about is when we're thinking about very complicated international legal challenges and how we would think about drafting policy or interacting with other countries is to see it as an opportunity, right? There's nothing worse than boredom. And what a gift that we have to live in an era where we have these challenges and we have these questions to ask, right? And we have the resources to start to answer them. And that's pretty damn cool if you think about it, even though it's a little overwhelming and a little bit scary. So I really liked this quote. If we don't have obstacles, we weaken and we die. So talking just a tiny bit, I told you I would, about our program in Nebraska. So I'll finally answer the question, why the hell are we in Nebraska? And I ended on military space law for a reason. We are a cool 54 minutes on a good morning from Offutt Air Force Base. About 11 and a half years ago, the commander there said to someone on the Board of Regents for the university, my lawyer doesn't know enough about this. And I think that there should be a program that teaches my JAGs, or Judge Advocate Generals, more specialty information about the space and the cyber mission sets. And from the legal perspective, not the technical, but the legal piece of this. And we happened to have a faculty member on place who was an international law scholar and had very recently started writing in space pretty significantly. And so it kind of all fit together very quickly. About 4 years later, I came on board and I've been with the program for almost 7 years next year since the program started. So we still continue to have a really close relationship with U.S. Strategic Command. But we weren't just in the military piece of this, right? We have a lot of partners in the commercial sector, and our program actually started with a really significant NASA grant. So we have been partners with NASA multiple times. Just last year, we had a $250,000 gift from NASA to create the Space Law Network, which is a national to international network of space scholars and encouraging young lawyers to think about space and write in innovative technologies and do scholarly work in that subject area. We do run public-focused annual conferences. We have one at U.S. Strategic Command that's really about operational law. We do a commercial space conference each year in Washington, D.C., open to the public, and then we run one in Nebraska every spring coming up this April on the digital divide and telecommunication services for rural areas and how basically satellite constellations can help solve some of those rural divide issues from a policy perspective. So different options for law students and attorneys to access our curriculum, but that's a really quick and dirty on who we are and what we do. I like to end on this slide, particularly when I'm talking to Nebraskans, right? We are a state school. We are a land grant institution. That means in many ways I work for you, or work for me. I'm a taxpayer too, I suppose, right? But this is important to me that people know the reach that we have. We are one of those tiny specialty programs. We're super niche. I don't have this robust 400-person large alumni body from even the last 11 years, right? We are quite small. But even with our tiny numbers and even in our ridiculously niche profession and scholarly area, this is the reach that we have. This is where I have students at Alumni Advisory Board, and the cutoff for their logo to be on the slide is 18 months. Right? So maybe an intern left somewhere or something like that. But within the last 18 months, someone from Nebraska has had this type of reach coming from our program. And I think that's something that Nebraskans should know about and be proud of, because this is something that we do together as a university. So a little bit of Star Trek, a little bit of space law, a little bit of promo, I won't lie about that. And now I'm happy to take any questions that anyone has. I believe because they're recording this, you need to wait for her to come with you to the mic. Or if you're shy, you can talk to me after. Oh, that's fine. I don't need it up behind me while I'm answering questions.
So I guess kind of like, given the fact that we have probably sort of, or the beginning of a process of actually getting out and finally colonizing other places, probably, potentially, at least hopefully mining asteroids and other things. Do you think the Outer Space Treaty is like at all still relevant, or is there any way to salvage it, or is it just basically kind of one of those things that served a purpose but is now faded away into sort of irrelevancy as law has moved on?
So this is like the cliche, traditional like law answer. It depends, right? I know we're the worst, but it does. It really does just depend. So I think that's a really relevant comment, and it's something that we've been arguing. It was the 50th anniversary of the Outer Space Treaty was last year, and so we argued about this at lots of conferences, right? How relevant is this document still? Now, most countries still find it to be quite relevant, right? A good example of that is just in 2015, which, given the slow pace of the laws, relatively recent, we passed a national legislation that basically approved from United States companies our interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty to allow for space mining, right? We said if a US company wants to go mine an asteroid, we'll back you up. We think that that is within the bounds of the Outer Space Treaty. Now, within, hours of that passage, people in the United Nations, particularly China and Russia, said that is outside the scope of the Outer Space Treaty. They absolutely cannot do that, and they were 100% relying on that treaty. Now, until we actually go do it, there's no cause of action, right? So now all we said is that we think you can do it, but no one's actually been harmed because we haven't done it yet. But certainly states are still relying on it, of course, where they want to. And other ways, I think we're not using it anymore, right? When I talk about space debris, right? There's been lots of contamination issues and very few sanctions brought, right, or reactions to that. And I know it sounds pessimistic or cynical, but I do contend and agree with what I said earlier that I don't think that treaty would pass today. We looked at, particularly when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, the amount of times and effort that was made with particularly the European Union to pass any arms control agreements in regards to space behavior, and never could get anything off the ground. Right? And that was just some proliferation agreements or some arms control agreements that were in the spirit of the Outer Space Treaty but clarified some language. So it's problematic to figure out where that's going to fit, and it really becomes, that's why space law is pretty fun too. It really becomes diplomatic and political really quickly. I don't know if that answered the question or not. Thank you for having a question. It's okay to not have questions. It really is. I'm not hurt.
So you said that the treaty probably wouldn't pass if it was like today. So have nations always followed it, or are there instances where they just do whatever they want to do and regardless of the treaty?
For the most part, nations have followed it, in some ways because the technology hasn't made it super easy to breach it. Right? So for the most part, I think people honor the treaty. Like I mentioned, the Canada-Russia case, that went in front of the ICJ, was arbitrated, but technically that was all within the terms of the treaty, right? Russia was liable. They had to arbitrate it out, figure out what that liability meant from a financial consequence, and they did it. So for the most part, I think that people have been faithful to the treaty. The U.S. takes our treaty responsibilities and our obligations under laws of armed conflict very, very seriously. That's a really big point of our policy. And so certainly I feel that most of our legislation and activities that we do work very, very hard to adhere to that treaty language. So I would say that the majority of major space players do take it seriously.
You had mentioned that the whole Space Force idea wasn't a new thing and that had been brought up. How long have they been talking about something like that?
Since 1967. Oh, yeah, no, I mean, the idea of war in space is not new. We have proof positive of interference during major events in Geneva, for example, very recently, and going back much further than that, right? War in space is already happening, and legal answers to that have been unfolding slowly and surely over the years. We're part of a manual project right now, which is hopefully a persuasive academic document that we're working with 5 other institutions that are international, 4 basics, and then, or 4 core, and then a much bigger group that is 5 and beyond. To try and answer some of those questions, to figure out what the laws of armed conflict look like in space. As far as here in the United States, I will tell you we're sort of behind some of what other people might consider our adversaries in having military focus on space. And I think since that realization has happened, it's been a bigger issue to discuss. I don't know that a separate branch makes sense from a financial perspective for the country based on the size of our military currently, and I do think the Air Force does an excellent job, and the service individuals I work with, I think, are quite dedicated and have a really remarkable subject matter expertise and knowledge there. So it'll be interesting to see where that ends up living. They are re-standing up U.S. Space Command, and I say we did previously have a joint command that was focused in space at Peterson Air Force Base, also does operations at Schriever, Vandenberg in California, and then Offutt here in Nebraska. So it's kind of a 4-piece command, mostly housed at Peterson, and they are re-standing that up, which I think says quite a bit. All right, well, thank you for spending your night with me. If you have questions afterwards, either about the law school, about the program, or about Star Trek, I am happy to answer them. Thank you.